I'm your host, Nufatora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be discussing Teacher Student Bonding by Magnipulls. Joining me as always, I have the ultimate podcast guest and host, Hans Gutherson. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah,
So excited.
yeah, of course, of course. Especially to discuss something by one of the uh, I guess one of the best newer writers to come out.
Sure. Magnipulls is certainly a giant, and they've been writing for several years, or had been writing for several years. I think going back to, as a guess, I'm going to say 2015. Let me check. 2014. Looking at their DA page was their first story, it looks like.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what 2014 to 2022.
Yeah.
Several years of them writing relatively consistently, which is a longer span than a lot of writers, as we know,
Yeah.
and obviously grew a lot of popularity over those years.
Yeah, definitely. Uh, so, as a summary for the story, it's two eras of bullying come to a head during an after school detention that opens the door to exploration of the past and how it can affect the present and future.
Mm, I like it.
Yeah.
Sounds like God of War, the origin story. It's very
Huh.
exciting.
I'm glad my hooks have that much power.
No, I think
So,
that's a great way to sum it up. Yeah, awesome.
cool. So, it was first posted on March 19th, 2018. Where were you in life at that time?
Yeah. So 2018, I guess I'm like that's probably like the last year before I graduate university. Interestingly, I mean, so I've done a lot of writing at this point. I know Magnipulls really well. We're friends by this point because I interviewed him back in like 2017. We did a Q&A and we kept in touch. I had a period where like I went through all of the Camp No Anime series and basically like gave him my thoughts after every chapter, and he really enjoyed that, and we connected as writers and friends over writing, over stories, and a shared love for sort of what we were doing. So when I read this story, I was at a place where I already had like immense respect for him and the work he did, and I thought he had such a range where obviously even in 2018 I was seeing the cartoony over the top elements he was able to incorporate, and he really embraced that more and more in more recent years with shows like Rick and Morty, I think, inspiring him. And I think it was the guy who made the TV series Community. I think he was a big fan of his Magnipulls. And there was quotes he would bring up to me about how uh it's like just go as far as you want with the story. Like don't hold back, add in crazy elements, and just really be as creative as you want. And I think he really took that to heart in this story, because he doesn't hold back from having some kind of outrageous stuff that'll sort of that I would see here and recognize in later stories
Yeah.
with Michelle, my favorite character of all the characters he's ever made. And this teacher who I wish we saw more of, but I think fades to the background after this story. I don't think we see her again in the canon, but I could be wrong because he obviously did the rare thing of having a Marvel universe of stories that all did connect in pretty epic fashion and a lot of different characters fighting. He obviously did that deliberately earlier with in the sort of Civil War arc he had with the Fuchsia Freaks, and that was literally called like Civil War, and it was meant to just be like the Civil War Marvel's movie, and it's clearly a take on that. But even a more like evolved take in the recent stories with Michelle and the end of the Academy,
Hmm.
which was really epic. But yeah, yeah. Sorry, I think that was a lot of digressions. But 2018, I'm sort of like graduating university, knowing him pretty well, at a place where I've got some hits, but I think even at that point, he's way more popular than me. So I'm sort of looking up to him on DA of sort of like how do I learn from him, and sort of building on that friendship and working with him on projects, and in some ways just keeping in touch. So a big inspiration for me in a lot of ways. And in 2018, I think that was very, very much true, and in a really strong place.
Hmm. Very nice. Yeah, it's quite a lot to dissect there, but I wasn't really doing much, honestly, at the
Yeah,
time. I think I was just working. It's a pretty
yeah,
boring time in my life. Um, so one thing you see right off the bat is that it is a commission.
yes.
Do you think that being commissioned to do something has any effect on the final product instead of doing it just because you want to?
Wow, what a deep question. We could do 14 podcast episodes on that in general. I mean, it's a great question because I mean, on one level, the obvious answer is yes, because they're going to tell you to some extent what they want to see, and as someone who's done requests and like a very rare commission, I'm scared to charge people money for stuff, but having sort of launched a Patreon where we would request stories and I wrote them, um, for me the process was always like I had would give people generally I even before if I had on Wedgie Haven like a thread where I would say, okay, tell me like these 5 things. I had basically like a little form. That wasn't even a form. Just like who's the characters, what's the scene, and I'll write you this story. And I did that. And because they gave me only very basic stuff, I found a couple things would happen. I would find that I would need a lot more, want a lot more detail because I'd be like, what? Like they would give a one line of like somebody's giving someone a wedgie, but I'm like, wait, what's the context? Like when it, or they would give some super outrageous like suggestion, and I'd be like, okay, the only way I can make this make sense is if I have it to be a dream. So I did that in one story because the request was so insane, and I was like, "There's no way." So I'm just gonna be like, "It's so dumb," and the whole
Yeah.
thing was a dream. Um, so definitely from one angle, depending how involved the commissioner or the requester is, you'll probably be sending them the story before you post it and say, "How is this? Do you need any changes?" And depending on who you are, you would probably ideally make small tweaks or changes depending what they said, or if you they realize something you didn't, grammatical stuff. Ideally, you're not rewriting the whole story because that's
Yeah.
foolish and you shouldn't have to,
Yeah.
unless you like totally botch the prompt, in which case like what were you doing? But it could happen, I guess. Um, I think you're always, as a writer, going to, when you're doing a commission, doing a request, come up against that battle of like, how do I make this a story that's mine while fulfilling the needs of the person who wants it? And I know that's something I struggle with, and partly why I avoid commissions. Although people have requested them of me and they've reached out about it, and I've realized I could probably make a bit of money from it. It's There's always been that pressure of like the story I write has to be so much better if
Mm-hmm.
I charge them for it. It has to be like this dream come true if it's gonna be worth actual money.
Mm.
Whereas if it's a request, I can sort of do whatever, and I don't have to have the same pressure. But so clearly, yes, the pieces of it are someone's probably going to be having more input into the story and telling you what they want it to look like and shaping it in that way, balanced against your own sort of style, voice, tone, whatever you want to call it. That's going to be crafting a story you would usually put out. Um, and I mean, this can have different effects. I mean, Anime Panties knows famously that I really don't like his Naruto story he did, and he doesn't like it either. I think it's his least favorite piece he did, and it was a commission. And it's so outrageous and so over the top. And I think the same person who commissioned it from him reached out to me about it, and I was like, I'm not gonna do this. It's too crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And I read this story by Anime Penny. I'm like, this is so outrageous. Like, it's sort of an Anime Penny story because of how crazy it gets. Kind of like his hang Man story, which was super popular, but it's even crazier than that, and it's just so wild. And I'm like, is it a good Naruto fanfic? I don't think so. Is it a good Wedgie story? I don't know. So I mean, that's the trouble. Like when you
Yeah.
try to do something that maybe isn't your style or isn't for you, and I guess the question is if you're doing it just for the money. So I mean, there's so many layers to unpack in that, but hopefully I gave a bit of an overview into the challenges of it. I guess to bring it back to the story, when you have teacher student bonding, it's unclear in my mind how much of that was the commissioner's idea for it, how much of the characters they provided to Magnipulls, or if they simply gave something like, I want to have Michelle bully a teacher and give wedgies, and then Magnipulls filled in all those gaps with who's this going to be, what backstory there was, what the outfits are going to be, all of that. So depending on how much of that was given to him, that would certainly change the story, or how much sort of leeway he had, to the point where it might have simply been a story he'd write anyway, with just the idea that someone gave him a small kernel of an idea he was able to expand, if that makes sense.
I love that. Such a long-winded thought. It was great. There's
I'm
so much
sorry, I
there.
can't
That's
stop.
perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. And there's so much there. It sounds like something you're trying to get across is that if you're doing something because you're commissioned to do it, it's a lot more work.
Yes, yeah, I think that's fair. For in my case especially, because you know me, especially earlier, I would like never really edit, because I was too scared.
Mm-hmm.
If I edited a story, I would be like, this story sucks, I can't publish it, and like all those internal doubts would come in, and I'd be
Yeah.
like, this is so bad, I spent all this time on something. So I would like be like, okay, I'm done it, I'll post it, and if I look back years later, I'm like, oh, look at all these spelling errors, I could have made it way worse, and I found that once I edited stuff and I posted it, like I got better responses. Like I would do decent in other stories, but I would get better if they were edited. So that was a progression. But when you're doing it for a commissioner, in my mind that the pressure's there. Like you really want the story to meet their expectations and ideally exceed it. So you're like, I gotta edit it carefully. I have to very carefully look at their prompt, make sure I have all the elements of it. I didn't miss anything. Maybe ask them questions if something you want to make sure it's clear, or if you want to see, is there some other details you wanted in that you didn't originally give me. So work there in the front end of it, in the middle of the story, making sure it's fitting, that it's something they might like. And I mean, you could do a lot more work if you wanted, looking at other stories, if they're a writer that they've done, so what kind of stuff they like, or characters they've included and other commissions. Like you can do a lot of work in the middle part as you're writing it, and at the back end editing it and going over it again and sending it to them, and that whole process of like, do you send it to them, they have some notes and edits, do you make it, do you then post it, or do you maybe send it to them again for one final look, and like, how long does that process go on? So you're certainly right to sum it up as like, it is it probably should be, in my mind, more work, and it tends to be more work, and that's
Mm.
partly, I guess, why you're getting paid to do it,
Yeah.
because it's your time and it's your effort, and certainly writers should be getting paid. It's just, for me, a scary prospect.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you think with so much more work added on, do you think there's a greater reward that can be gained? Not beyond, not obviously like you get paid for it, you're getting money for it,
Certainly,
but
yeah,
do you think
yeah.
beyond that, do you think there is a greater reward because you put in so much more effort?
That's a great question. I would hope so. I would hope at the end of it, after you've gone paid and you brought your money and you're smelling your money and all that stuff, Mr. Krabs style, you're able to say like, yeah, like I earned this. Like I did a really good job with that story. In my case, after like doing Patreon stuff, for example, where I knew like I wasn't directly getting commission, but I knew the people in the Patreon were sticking around because of the quality content they requested. Seeing seeing like they were satisfied with the Marvel story I did, or the Xenoblade Chronicles X story I did, for example, these fanfics. I did Game of Thrones one too. Seeing like when I wrote them well and I edited them and I did it carefully and people liked it, that definitely felt good. Like because I didn't have any of that like any like hooks for the self doubt to seek into. Like I couldn't
Yeah.
put it out there and be like, oh, could this have been better? Like maybe I should have edited that because like that's the other side of the I don't edit because I'm scared coin. I'm looking at like maybe I should have edited it and it
Right.
could have been better. And like, and now I know because, like I said, after having done later pieces that I've carefully edited and seen great responses and more comments on them compared to ones I didn't, it's like I definitely editing is so important
Yes,
and
it
it's
is.
really good. So yeah, I think you're. I think there's definitely something to what you're saying. Like obviously beyond the money, which is table stakes, it's working very hard on the story and having it well received is definitely going to be a thrill compared to like I don't half-assing it or something, which
Yeah.
I suppose takes on a different connotation if you're a wedgie fetishist. But I'll coin that phrase too.
I like that. Okay. Yeah, very nice. Very well said. Um, yeah, this story seems to play out like a poker match, especially in
Mm,
the beginning. And it seems like Tracy plays her hand way too fast by telling Michelle what she believes are Michelle's insecurities, which is why I think it plays into why Tracy is the first to get a wedgie.
mm, I like that.
And the dynamic, it reminds me of the first meetings of Jennifer and Lilith in I Could Change Her by Saseda.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, which you have to read that
I
so we
do.
can
You're
talk
right.
about it.
You do. Yes. Yeah. 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 I feel like see the Magnipulls again. They're friends. They're of the same sort of school of thought with the stories that like obviously the cartoony element is going to reign supreme in their stories. And I think interestingly, Magnipulls the favorite story of mine they've ever done is one they did for a contest just called like No More Wedgies, and it was like super more realistic, down to earth about a fetish model who is leaving the game after having done a bunch of like wedgie fetish. And I thought that was my favorite story of theirs, and it was beautiful. It was awesome, and it's like one of those rare stories that I wish I had written because it was so good. But certainly most of their stories of like the Magnipulls, the Saseda, Sleep All of Today, like the same school of thought around they can be ridiculous and over the top and kind of meme-ish and jokey. So yeah, when we look at it like a poker game, which I think is an apt assessment, it certainly plays out very quickly. Where it's like I have this hand that I'm going to play, so to speak, and it's like I was a bully and I'm gonna put you in your place because I'm the teacher, and then Michelle's gonna call that bluff and give her the wedgie, and it's gonna they're going to sort of raise, and you could definitely see it play the whole thing out like a poker match. And in the end, they get to this place where you don't really there's no real winner, which I think is a fine way to end it because obviously it could be continued and they would continue on this interesting path of fighting and would any of them ever really win and how would that go? I mean, Michelle gets super buffed power wise to like an S tier character by the end of some of the later stories, so I don't know how that teacher plans to like compete with the so-called wedgie monster, as Magnipulls called her. But it'd be cool to see if she had kept appearing.
Yeah, I would have loved to see a
Yeah, it'd be
sequel to this
great.
story.
Yeah,
It's unfortunate there never was one. Uh,
yeah. That's the problem with a commission too. Like,
yeah,
what if like if the story's great, like can you even as a writer do a part two if like you're not getting commission to do it, or is that just like free stuff for the person who commissioned the first one? You know,
yeah,
I don't know how that
that's
works.
that's interesting. It's like a who owns the rights to the characters in the story,
Great
essentially.
question.
That's
Great
that
question.
seems like
Yeah, great question.
yeah, yeah. That's interesting because the
Yeah.
writer's the one who created it, but you you're paying for it to be created. So I think
Yeah. Yeah.
who really is
Exactly
the
right.
yeah, it's tough.
Yes, it's a great question. One we've never ever thought about in the community before, kind of unsurprisingly, because we're only just now, as I've said in recent years, starting to think businessy about these things.
Uh huh.
So I mean, if the commissioner, a person named Wedgos or Wedgos, who's no longer around, but in 2018, interestingly, was posting on stories like a Marvel superhero wedgie one and also High Velocity. So clearly, it adds like a superhero-y vibe, which is probably why they were attracted to Magnipulls for the commission. Yeah, if they had wanted a sequel or if they had wanted to repost the story or if they'd
Mm-hmm.
wanted to, I don't know, like it depends maybe how much of the characters of Tracy and all of these other past characters they had contributed. Like at what point does it become like a thing where they're sharing the rights to the brand and the characters and like I don't know, it's kind of bonkers to think about and interesting.
Yeah, it's seems like it's a case of um, calling it a rental or a purchase.
Interesting. Yeah,
I think that's what it comes down to.
makes sense. Yeah. Because I mean, the Wedgos could have posted the story on their page. That's what I tend to do with art, as people who watch me know. Like I ask the artist for exclusivity because I want to
Yeah.
draw the attention of my page. Obviously, I'll note who the artist was. That's a given, and I let artists know that. But when I'm commissioning them, like I want the piece on my page. I want people to see it there, fave it there,
Yeah.
etc., etc. Um,
Huh.
and that's obviously we're not touching on any of the stuff about piracy and stealing art and stories. 'Cause that's a whole other thing which we don't have like good resources to tackle yet. It
Yeah.
feels like as a community. Although it's happened to me, as you know, with Lucy and Daniela, where someone stole the story and just changed the names to
Yeah.
Fox and Stacy, which
Yeah.
were better names for the characters. And I had to like for years or follow up with him, and like I gave up for him a bit, and I pushed and I said, please get rid of this, and they finally did. But like if you don't have the resources or patience, like stuff like that's gonna slip by, and people are gonna get love for stuff you did.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and even when I first got on DA, people thought I'd stolen like the wedgie stories from Lucky Fish forums. They're like, "You're stealing," it. And I love that they knew the stories, but
Yeah.
I did not love they didn't know it was me who had written them. So you can see some very like testy messages I wrote where it's like I very clearly say a profile on this character, and I say on Lucky Fish forums I'm the same dude, and like it's very clear that they're from one and the same. But so that's a piece of it. But certainly, yeah, like it's interesting that Magnipulls would post them because as a writer and as an artist, if you're commissioned, you want to be able to show some of that
Mhm.
and say, "Look, I'm getting commissions. Look at this cool thing I wrote." So, do you give up like that exclusivity? A lot of artists I know they're happy to do that, and they've done it for me. In the case of like a full real fetish, I only bring this up quickly so people have an idea of an alternative. They had two versions of the same piece, sort of, showing different angles, and I picked the one that I thought was far superior, because it showed like the wedgie more in the butt, and he posted like the faces and stuff, the other side of it, and I was
Hmm.
okay with that because I still had a piece, and they were still able to show like they had done it. In some cases, you won't be able to get that exclusivity because people are marketing and they want to say like, "Look at my page, come commission me, look at the good work I did," building up their own portfolio,
Mhm.
understandably. So yeah, from a writer perspective, that is similar, but not something we see a lot of, where people are posting stories other people have written for them. Generally, the model is writers will post them themselves, as we see obviously with Shadow Melder and his wonderful commissions he does as a recent example.
Well, yeah, and with the story Secret Santa we did in
Yes,
2020,
great
that's
example.
we there were
Great example.
multiple of us who wrote stories for each other, but
Yeah.
we posted them ourselves rather than the person that we wrote them for. poster.
Yeah,
So that's a very tough uh, thing to figure out.
yeah.
I'm not
It
sure
might
how to do it.
require some experimentation to see what works. Like if we do
Yeah,
another Secret Santa, do we have the people we send it to post them as and say
right.
like this is a gift from so and so, or like how does that work? Do we post them ourselves? I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
yeah. I think that's a topic for another day. I don't quite have the answers.
Sure, sure.
One thing I love is how Magnipulls gives fantastic indirect detail about how much Tracy actually gives a shit about her job, knowing that Michelle isn't actually writing an apology when she's scribbling furiously. I love
Yeah,
that. It's like
yeah,
if she didn't care, she wouldn't even pick up on that's something that students do. But
yeah,
because she's paying attention to things like that and she's actually addressing it, I think it fantastically shows that
yeah.
she's probably actually a really good teacher.
I like that. That's interesting. And I mean, that's partly why I love a sequel. Because, like, what could she teach Michelle? Like,
Yeah,
Michelle, as we see, obviously in layer stories, goes through this big dramatic arc. And we'd have to talk about the entire catalog of Magnipool stories to explain why that's significant. But here we see her at this sort of peak bully level of sorts. Not, or at a point where she's clearly single-minded in her bullying, and she meets it's the same thing we see in other stories. This cliche of the immovable object and the unstoppable force, a sort of
yeah,
favorite genre because it's very straightforward, and we have that here with the two of them. Tracy obviously having like very like an infamous wedgie experience to lean back on, but more than that, she's got this history of bullying, so
hmm
she's not a stranger to it. So, but and I wonder like now that she's a teacher, I would love to know more about that evolution of her. Like, why did she go from bully to teacher to sort of
yeah,
things that are totally separate in a lot of ways. Although maybe there's some like psychological and philosophical overlap you could say about setting people straight or something. Um, but and it's certainly interesting to think what could they teach each other. You're right that she's certainly is interested. She's her mind obviously drifts as anyone's mind does, and she's not paying super attention to Michelle, but she doesn't let her get away with anything. She keeps her in the detention. She's willing to push back against her. Like she's not a pushover, as some of the sort of teachers in the Magnipulls universe are, who are ineffective or ineffectual. It's
yeah,
like this teacher who does care about Michelle learning a lesson, even if she takes it to like these extreme lengths to do that. Like
yeah.
she doesn't shy away from being a part of teaching her lessons, and I think that does speak to the fact she is a good teacher, although her methods are obviously
A
questionable.
little skewed, but they work
Yeah,
out.
exactly. But yeah, what do we expect? You know, a wedgie story.
Exactly. Now, conversely, it's a little too direct for my taste when
Mm,
Michelle flat out says she's a bully and proud of it. Yeah,
yeah.
it kind of gives readers a touch of this is a wedgie story. Here are the tropes.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. One other another detail about Tracy that I love is very humanizing thing of her trying to make amends for her bullying past in a misguided
Mm,
way. And I think
yeah.
it's something that so many people do. You know, like the things we do to try and make things better often end up simply helping us sleep at night rather than actually fixing situations. And it's something that Tracy's trying to do, and it's really humanizing. I love it.
Yeah, there's a depth to a lot of Magnipul's stories, and we see that here, where clearly they're very good wedgie stories on one level. They're very descriptive wedgies. The dialogue is always fun
Hmm.
and creative, and the word comes up a lot, which is always exciting for me, and I think a lot of readers. But then on the other side of it is these very human characters. We're dealing with very human things, which we don't often see. The fuchsia freaks have a lot of trauma, being in like orphanage and dealing with stuff like intense bullying or very bad home lives. I mean, Michelle had an abusive mother, I think it was, and a father who was a bit of a doormat, and that really messed her up, as we see in later stories. Um, so like pretty intense stuff for a quote unquote wedgie story, and I mean Tracy, like you point out, it has this obviously cartoonish Lucy and Daniela ish bully history, but wants to do better and wants to be a teacher. And it feels like from this story, like she's not going around giving kids wedgies. Like she's kind of meeting Michelle where she's at, because I guess she knows she can do it, and Michelle's not going to go around telling anybody or anything like that's going to happen. There's not going to be any consequences beyond maybe they can come to some kind of stalemate and she can learn something.
Hmm.
So it's really interesting, and I think it's a really cool point you bring up for sure.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up like a Lucy and Daniela type bullying past, because another thought that I had is that I got a very strong impression that Tracy is in this story what Daniela would go on to become in the aftermath of Lucy and Daniela.
It feels like it. And I mean, even
Yeah.
in Lucy and Daniela, I have a teacher who was formerly a bully who's giving advice to a bully character trying to set them on the right path. And I did that 2 years before we get teacher student bonding. So it feels to me, I hope he maybe took some inspiration from that. I know eventually when he started reading my stories, he did like them, and we were able to bond over a lot of that stuff. And I mean, even in 2018, I'm coming more into prominence with stories like a special wedgie for your birthday. It was 2018, and that was like one of my first like big DA hits that was like native to DA. So I'm getting more attention. So maybe he saw that. He was like, "What? Take some inspiration from it." I would love that. I know that'd be great.
Yeah.
I know when he left, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, so I won't go too deep because I can bring up something later. I just know when he left DA, he sent me a sort of beautiful, very short note mentioning like how I encouraged him and stuff. And then we can go more into that later. But so it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility they maybe took some inspiration from Lucy and Daniela for that, or maybe it's a coincidence. You'll have to get him on the podcast and ask him.
Yeah, well, I don't know how successful I'll be in that regard.
I've tried many times, and now with him being sort of off of DA, it might be a dream for never, but you never know. Maybe.
That's a fantastic phrase. I never heard someone say
It,
that before. A dream.
Me neither. I just made it up and I
Yeah.
said it and I was
A
like, that
dream
should
for
be a
never.
band name and
Yeah.
a
That
story
wow.
name and I'm a genius. This is why
that
they pay me the
that was
big
beautiful.
bucks. Yeah, it was.
A
You're
dream for
welcome, Wedgie
never.
community.
Wow. I'm just sitting on that for a minute. That was awesome.
Just quote me on it if you use it. Just say, and as
I'm
Hans
definitely gonna
Gutherson
use it.
said,
I'm definitely gonna
a
use it,
dream
and
for never. Just quote me. You use it
I'll
a million times. Just say, and like that one, like what I do sometimes when I would randomly like meta mention real writers and say, and Magnipulls and Anime Pennies did that or said that, and sometimes jokingly to like poke fun at like Anime Pennies tropes or something.
yeah.
Um,
What's the
but yeah, just please just quote me.
what's the thing that you put together for a scientific paper? Like all the things that you've pulled quotes from. It's like a list of something.
Oh, like a bibliography, you mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
a like
What
a
and
citations, like references,
yeah.
something like that, yeah.
I'll cite you in my story.
Do it, cite me, yeah. Do it. That'd be great.
So, while Tracy is remembering her past, there is quite a bit of very direct detail happening, and I was a little disappointed that Magnipulls didn't allow readers to infer some of those details instead.
Mm.
but that's not my. It's that's my own taste.
Yeah. I like that you bring it up and that you're sort of consistent in knowing this when you see it, because I
Oh
mean
yeah,
it is something that you care much about, and I think it's fair. I'm sure a lot of readers probably are at a point where some of that either brings them out or brings them in or takes them out of the story one way or the other.
oh yeah,
But yeah, certainly I because the story is quite short too, and it's I guess a one-off commission. You wanna probably try and make everything clearer than you maybe could if you knew
that's
like
true.
I'm gonna expand this out into multiple parts. And I had no idea if at some point Magnipulls said I want to continue this and have more, like maybe if they got commissioned for sequels we'd have gotten more. Maybe that's the only way that happens. Um, as a sort of one-off, I think it kind of works because we get like very clearly who the characters are. And but although yeah, certainly there's another version of the story, as we often say when we're talking, you and I, where it's more indirect. And Tracy, maybe it isn't just laid out as clearly as it is that she was a bully, but maybe the way she does things and the way she wedges Michelle sort of, it clicks for her. Like, wow, she's not a nurse, she's a bully. And like, I would love a crazy like a long form story where Michelle is looking through old yearbooks or something, and she finds like Tracy giving wedgies in the yearbook or something, and like she reveals that she was a big bully, and like starts to learn from her that way. And she's got this secret past as a bully she doesn't want anybody to know about. Maybe that's a totally different way to tell the story, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure. um, but it is interesting though, because I was looking at I saw a couple. I remember a couple of the couple of random stories that I posted. They people are always asking, like, people asked at the time, like, I hope work when's the sequel coming, do more of this. And I there's a lot of
Yeah,
that. There's a lot of that on teacher student bonding
it's
as
true.
well.
Yeah.
So it's a I guess I'm not quite sure of the word to describe it. I guess it's an interesting look at, like, I guess an area that you could go in, that I guess you sort of know that is open to you if you want to explore it, um, versus like how much of the time you actually are interested in continuing or just keeping it as a one-off.
Yeah. Yeah. There's only so much time, effort, energy we writers have. As we know, writing takes
Mm-hmm.
tremendous energy to do and a lot of work. So, do you focus on a sequel to this story, like a teacher student bonding, or do you, in Magnipul's case, build out a massive crossing over universe of stories and deep arcs and history of a character that has mentions all the way back to like the first story he ever posted? I think like he does crazy stuff like that. And so certainly it's a question of effort you want to put in. And I know even before he left, he was doing really popular sort of like Batgirl stories and things like that, which were great and people really liked. And starting a fantasy series, Roxy and Mira, that sort of, I guess, is petered out into nothingness now that he's gone. Um, but yeah, it's certainly this the whole dynamic, like power and character dynamics of a teacher and student appealed to a lot of people who read that. It has a good number of favorites and views and comments, as you said, for more. And we know Lucy and Daniela similarly was popular, and maybe partly because of that dynamic, although it's certainly not really as central to it as this story was, obviously. But maybe that's something you can explore more. And I mean, obviously, Wedgie Lover 109 and Jake and Gwen teachers play a bigger role in that in some sexual ways, and Wedgie's in those stories very popular. So yeah, I think there's certainly something to this to that I think is idyllic and interests the community if people are like, what would be a hot dynamic to write about? look no further than teachers and students is maybe what they can take from this.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think it's very important to keep consistency as a critic. So I'm glad you picked up on that.
Mm.
I never noticed until carefully scrutinizing for this podcast that Magnipulls includes an underage character in the form of the freshman
Oh,
Lonnie.
okay.
It's always such a letdown to
It's
find out that an
always,
underage character is in a story you
oh,
really enjoy. Yeah,
yeah, it is.
and it, yeah, it's, it's oh, it's a disappointing.
Yeah.
So, as I guess is the usual call out, no underage content. That's it. Um, I think to move on to something else, I think he threw off expectations of classic bully nerd tropes by having Brooke speak so openly to Tracy's group of bullies about her plan to overthrow them.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
was it was quite refreshing, but also felt a little
Yeah.
odd given the details just prior of all the nerds in school basically trembling in fear.
Mm, yeah. It's fascinating to see. I mean, it's funny how like some stories take it very seriously. This whole idea of this hierarchy and almost like the Star Wars like rebellion is how I pictured it because and I just forgot the name of the story. I'll say Ridgemont High, but that wasn't it. There was a popular series of stories that took it incredibly seriously. I can get the name of it for you, where like they had all these bullies and these nerds, and it became this very intense Star Wars rebellion where they had to hide the leader of the nerds from the bullies because they knew they were after them and they were moving them around, and they had these very intense like factions set up across the school, and it was crazy how elaborate it was. Um, and that was before that story sort of died out, but it went from like a bully picking on a nerd to an incredible rebellion, like how do you start an insurrection kind of thing. And now we get that kind of here in Magnipulls as well, sort of comedically trying to end the wedgies and start this
Yeah.
campaign. I mean, we see that later on with some of the teachers doing similar stuff. They do like the lockdown and like the I think Calypso Academy series, where the whole thing was like trying to get the kids to stop fighting and stop giving each other wedgies because it is such a prevalent problem, not just in the school but in like the entire world basically of Magnipulls and his universe. I think he calls it a Magniverse, I think.
Mhm.
So the whole thing. So it's certainly funny to see like an early prototypical example of like someone trying to shut down the bullying, and then what we get, obviously, in the end of like the Wedgie Witch War, which is his final big crossover thing, is like there's a magical being who's giving out wedgies, and a group has to rebel and take them down. So let's a much larger scale, much cartoonier, much more fantastical. But that same kernel of an idea of like, what if there was someone who's gonna stand up to the bullies, and obviously, it's a great example of, and a great way to sort of characterize Tracy. Not only is she taking out some other nerds in this story, she's taking out the nerd who, if not stopped, would potentially ruin bullying, would take
Mhm.
down her hierarchy. And not only does she give her a wedgie, she embarrasses her in front of the whole school. So she's brutal. She's not
Yeah.
afraid of consequences. She is harsh and like even by 2018, we'd have seen Michelle do stuff like this. So fans of his coming into it, he's probably aware of some expectations around Michelle. And like I noted, she's not the Godzilla like wedgie monster yet, who we see later. But certainly you're going to be thinking, okay, her opponent, whoever she goes up against, has to be tough. If you want it to be a tie, she has to be strong. So putting her in the flashback that he does, I think, is a very good way to show a lot about her character.
Wow. I love that you brought all that up because it just is a yet another example that goes to show that there can be so much to read into and draw from.
Mm.
even
Yeah,
in short stories,
totally.
if we make them that way.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. There's another version of the story where we don't get a lot of that. We get it really
Yeah.
trimmed down, and we just have the two of them have a little wedgie fight. The end.
Mhm.
But Magnipulls clearly took a lot of care, and he notes in the comments something like he didn't expect it to be this long of a story or something.
Yeah.
Which sort of goes to show, like, yeah, there's a lot of details put into there that we can look at and say, like, yeah, the fact she's wedging who she's wedging in the context that she is,
Mhm.
that's significant, and it's not just like another summary of some other wedgie. Like, we get enough of a flashback, we get dialogue, we even get, as one of the commenters points out, like a Spider-Man 3 meme where, like, if you want, was it forgiveness, or if you want something, get religion. I forget the Bully Maguire
Yeah.
quote. But he even fits that in
Yeah.
because and you know it goes back to that superhero-y thing we're talking about, like probably partly again why Wedge O's went to him for the commission and stuff. But and that it's that jokey sort of memey stuff we see. Like I love in Haley the Bully when the cheerleaders appear and they have like this like a character even says like why do I hear boss music, like the meme and stuff, and like they
Yeah.
come in, they're doing flips and they're doing a cheer to Avril Lavigne's girlfriend song and they're changing the lyrics and it's so memey and they're like you I want to give you a wedgie or something was like the lyric, and I was like I love that, it was so memey, it's so jokey, so over the top. um and we kind and so like that's what he does years later, but I feel like a lot of what we see in this story is like prototypical of what he'll do a lot more of
Mhm.
later, and what he's been building towards, because he's done like Camp Noname, which is kind of down to earth but has some kind of crazy bonkers stuff, and so it's like this interesting bridge between the two worlds of like kind of more realistic stuff he's doing and more over the top kind of crazy stuff we'd get later on, if that makes sense.
Definitely. I love you. That's the Mimi. I love that. I haven't. I'm kind of curious then what you see in this story could be cartoonish or jokey.
I mean, obviously the teacher and the student and the way they bond for the wedgies. I mean, it's clearly like there's as I keep saying, people are probably tired of that expression. Like there's the different version of the story where there's like weirdly neither of them get a wedgie in the story. Like a Lucy and Daniela scene where they're talking or something. Maybe Michelle opens up, but and obviously she's not going to open up in the Magnipulls lore for years. In terms of when he writes, and canonically, probably it's not years until she does open up because she's still in the school. Um, but it's gonna be a while until we learn some of her backstory. But maybe that's something we get instead of like they start fighting, with wedgies and they end at this stalemate and there's no consequences, stuff like that. I mean, obviously the memeiest thing is, as you point out, sort of the character Brooke, who's ready to take down the bullies and do a speech in front of the whole school about like addressing the bullies and putting them in their place. It's like that's not gonna happen. Like the teachers are gonna be the ones who
Okay.
are gonna be like disciplining the students. There's not gonna be some moment where you can get on stage and like give them a public wedgie, and that somehow is going to like not make her a martyr that ends the bullying. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
stuff like that is very cartoony, but obviously very fun, and I quite enjoy
Yeah.
this story for that,
Yeah.
certainly.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. I can definitely see all those. Yeah, it's kind of funny to me, like going along with that, is that a legitimate police officer would have the time to speak on bullying. Yeah, it makes me curious.
Yeah.
It makes me curious to know how productive or efficient the rest of the precinct is, if they're doing this rather than actually looking for crime.
Yeah, you know why I love that? Because Tanya's dad, Tanya, obviously, if you're not a huge Magnipulls fan, is like the heart and soul of basically the Magnipulls universe. Who the lead in Camp Noname, the lead in a lot of other stories. and the sort of big center of it all. Her father is a police officer who's incredibly preoccupied with the fuchsia freaks because they bullied Tanya
Yeah.
early on. So yeah, they're very much interested in bullying. That never goes anywhere. Interestingly, it seems to be a through line that like there are police. They do arrest the fuchsia freaks and put them in jail for a few episodes of the series. I don't remember if they escape or what happened. The fans are gonna have to check me on that. But they clearly aren't in jail later on, so something happens. But so like they're kind of at times effective. I mean, a lot of the stories mention like they're looking for the future freaks. They still haven't found them. Tanya's dad is freaking out because they're still on the loose and giving wedgies and stuff. So it's fascinating that like there's this theme of like cops and wedgies that is a
Hmm.
that's like kind of rare unless the cops are characters getting wedgies, which we see occasionally in stories.
A nice consistency.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay. Yeah, when I got to the point where Principal White reacts to Lonnie's alert to bullying in the chess club, it
Yeah.
brought to mind the cliche in Wedgie stories where the teachers in schools either don't care or are completely ineffectual in stopping bullying from happening. Why do
Yeah.
you think that was such a common trend back in the day and still continues to pop up now and again?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and so there's definitely those two, and the third and less common one is like they encourage it or somehow are a part of it.
Yeah.
They're like part of a system where it's happening. Like
Wedgie Academy.
Wedgie Academy is a great example, and
Yeah.
I was thinking of the other example is Break Free,
Yeah.
where clearly there's some like you don't even I think even see teachers or adults in that, but it's clear someone set up this system and and wedgies are supposed to happen. So that's
Excommunicado.
another example. Yes, yeah. So I think it's because, and it comes back to that theme I know I've hit on you in a trope or motif of stories, whatever we want to call it, that like there can't be consequences in the story. That's
Yeah.
not a thing that happens. Partly because it would be so depressing if like every wedgie story ended with someone going to jail or and talking to cops about how they assaulted somebody. Like that would not be very turn on ish or arousing to keep having every story be like this was bad and you're in trouble now for what you did. Plus, realistically, as we know, those of us who've given wedgies sometimes when you're younger or whatever, you typically aren't getting in trouble because they're not huge things. They're not over the top like in some of these stories. So to make it like realistic to a point where like the story doesn't always end with the cops or whatever, you're gonna have the principals, the teachers be ineffectual, ineffective, not know what's going on, or they're just not gonna care, as we see in Magnipulls, where they're just like this stuff happens, but like kids are gonna be kids. What are we gonna do about it? Maybe some teachers are gonna complain about it, or they're gonna be like, "This is happening too much," but it's not like they're going to really set off on some campaign. And if they do, they're typically gonna be the ones getting wedgies, which I think happens to a principal in later Magnipool stories, not Principal White. Um, Interesting to think too that Principal White is a man, and the place sort of men hold in wedgie stories in general, which is kind of limited if we think about especially FF stories, which is primarily what Magnipulls was writing. But even more generally, I think a fair not assumption, but summary is that men are often sort of in the background. They're not really present or particularly effective. Kind of like Tanya's dad, who for a lot of the stories is struggling to capture the young, like teens who are giving wedgies, which you think realistically shouldn't be that difficult, but he's not able to do it for a very long time. And men are often, if they're on screen shown, like I said, which is rare to begin with, kind of relegated to these more like subservient roles. I know that's the case in my stories generally, where the men are like in YWNR, we get the dude who's like literally the wife talks over him in the beginning, and we don't really see him at all. And we don't really see dudes at all in a lot of my earlier stories. And then obviously the exception to this is the dudes who are doms who are very strict and like giving the wedgies and stuff like that. So
Yeah. Um, I yeah, that's it's interesting to look at it like that. Like where.
I had to step off. I'm back now.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, okay. It's interesting to look um at the role that males play. That's interesting to look at.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be the case that, yeah, definitely, that men really aren't. Uh, if women are getting the wedgies, it doesn't seem like it's very often the case that men are present at all.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that does. I think it reflects on um, the tastes of the people that are making the content.
Yes.
But I wonder if there's also a piece of it that speaks on maybe some kind of unspoken guidelines that we've picked up on. I don't want to say like laws, but like guidelines that we might have set for ourselves.
Certainly. I think that's a fantastic observation. I mean, when I mention myself doing it in my early stories, you just have to look at where I came up on Lucky Fish forums, where males were off limits and you didn't
Yeah,
have them. So, like YWNR, which was not posted originally on Lucky Fish forums, but on Widgie even has that dude very, very slight role in the beginning and like no dudes really anywhere. Um, and that's I think a holdover from that. My interest, like you said, but also like this idea that like I know the rules, I can't have guys in it, or Lucky's gonna bring the hammer down on me and ban me,
yeah,
or just no one's gonna like it because we see before I'm posting those stories, there's comments like no dudes, don't have dudes, and it's very clear that's not what that community there is interested in. So then obviously if you go further afield, you go to like a Wedgie Haven, Wedgie Buddies, like you get different versions of males, but usually you get the doms and you get the subs, and they're clearly delineated between the two. Who's giving, who's receiving, and you get the switches who are in the middle. And some stories just are simply about that relationship. One episode, someone's giving to the receiver, and the switches giving and or getting, and
hmm
it goes on like that. And then we get some nuance in stories like Fortunate Events, where it feels like the men play a central role and aren't just sort of like wedgie dolls who are giving or getting, which is what we kind of see in really well known MF stories, like the ones Bloom 225 was doing, which are RPs, and very clearly just like you would get little moments where the characters are hanging out, but it's very much just like what Wedgie is the male going to give Peyton, which was a Bloom stand-in, today, and that was very much just the order of those stories generally. So yeah, the place of males in sort of wedgie fish fiction is an interesting one. Obviously, a different conversation depending if we're talking about FM, MM. Like FM is interesting too, obviously, as a quick digression, just because then the men are getting dominated by women, which is a very cool, and I like reversal because it's
hmm
not always obviously that way in real life,
right,
but women getting that power I think is obviously great, and I'm very much
yeah,
into FM stories. I love them, and there's a great demand for them in the community because they're still sort of underdone,
mm.
but very popular whenever they come out and are good. So yeah, obviously the role of men there is going to be different compared to when it's MF stories and they're DOMs. Often you could probably write essays on this, but often in that case they're kind of creeps who are like I don't know burglars or something of that nature who are giving wedgies to women
Creeps.
and stuff like that. We see that though. You've seen that probably right in Lucky Fish forums and like they just come in and like they're these doms who are pervy and creepy and like or we get the more nuanced like they're the boyfriend who's given the wedgies or what we see in kind of more recent stories,
There,
including the Magnipulls one of like you save a wedgie girl. It's like you are the dude is like a hero, a savior who as reward gets to give wedgies, which is what we see in JCCW's three wedgies perspective. So that's maybe like the newer trend wedgie fetishist as savior, something like that.
Okay. Hmm. Well, thank you for pointing that out about fortunate events. I like that. Eh, the only one that comes to mind is the one that Saseda did in uh, Suzanne the Unlucky and Her Acquaintances.
Mm,
That collection of four stories.
yeah,
The one
and I
with
have read.
Carlos. I can't remember the other character's
Yes.
name, but
Yeah.
that one's that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head that I've read. But I like the swapping of power. I like that. Um,
Yeah.
in the same vein as my earlier question, I have to question the morals of the school itself to allow such a major bully to become a teacher.
Yeah.
I'm extremely curious to know what Tracy did to be able to be hired, as it's only been 10 years since that incident,
Yeah.
and I'm sure there are still faculty members remaining from that time with tenure
Yeah,
and
you
all
think
that. So
so? Interesting.
what did she have to do to be able to become
Yeah,
a teacher at that
I love
school,
that.
at the specific school that
Yeah.
she did these things?
I love that. That's what I was saying. I want the story where
Yeah,
like Michelle's uncovering her bully past. Like I
yeah,
want the story where like she thinks she's a nerd. Everybody thinks she's a super nerdy teacher. She the teacher, Miss Tracy, gives Michelle this really epic wedgie. Michelle's like, "What the? How'd she what? She's a nerd. How'd she do that?" She randomly finds old like books, old yearbooks and stuff. Finds these pictures and it clicks like, "Wow, she was a big bully or something like." And then how did she get past other people? Does she look different now? Is she like wearing glasses or something, like Clark Kent style, and no one recognizes her? Like, yeah, what did she do? Because even if like people aren't still there, even if like nobody's the same, which you think some people, even if janitors or something, you think would be similar, like, wouldn't there still be like a kind of like a mythic event in the school's history, like just part of that reputation, and people would tell stories about that year after year, and it could pass down to like the freshmen, like, oh, don't be bad, or like the bully's gonna get you on stage like they did 10 years ago just to scare the nerds or something like that. And we see that, and so kind of occasionally in wedgie stories, but not too much. There was a short story by I think Vickers, but it might not have been. Um, where I think they had an idea that like Selena Gomez could play a character in this, if I recall correctly, and like it started out with like the character hearing a story about like a wedgie that happened to someone on like
freshman.
yeah, the freshman, right? Yeah,
Yep.
and
Which the whole
I
thing
think
is
something like that would be
underage.
there. It's right, it is. Rick's is all freshmen, so it's
Yeah.
sad how much is on there on the
Yeah.
board. And it sneaks by. It's sad.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah, I like that. I don't know. One trope that I do love is girls wearing ridiculously stretchy underwear with super colorful patterns. And to a point,
Yeah.
I mean ridiculously stretchy to real world underwear, not underwear that can stretch for miles. That's too much for me. But like when they're able to, if they're able to get like really good wedgies pretty easily, I love that trope.
Yeah. It's so common in Magnipulls stories, obviously. Like the underwear always is super stretchy,
Mm-hmm.
and to the point where there's literally stores in it, like the town that make
Yeah.
like there's like two stores at one point competing against each other, and he goes into the dynamics of these competing stores and how
Really?
they're
Wow.
trying to like one up each other and stuff and compete, and like how they're running out of stock, and like it's literally in like the Wedgie Witch War too. They have a deal with this one store to deliver a lot of underwear because they need it to like keep wedging people. It's crazy, like how oversized it is, and how obviously it's all very colorful. And I think that's partly where our love of that trope comes from, is like Magnipulls and others like that, like Sasetta and Sleep All Today, who don't shy away from like the bat prints on Sandra's underwear, the chocobos obviously on Carol's underwear. These like iconic designs that we recognize with these characters. I think it's like the early example of what we think of now as like brand building for these stories. And when you have art, it's not just like this character had nondescript underwear. It's like they had very nerdy and stretchy pairs that were something you could recognize, something you could think about, like even between two cheeks with Ashley and Luna, and Ashley was wearing like Zelda underwear in one episode and stuff, and stuff like that. So you could sort of look at that and be like, yeah, this is more significant and sticks in your brain more than just like a white pair that stretches and whatever. Like it's no obviously mistake or random coincidence that their underwear is so stretchy, because Magnipulls doesn't shy away from really epic and huge wedgies in any story.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Okay. Very nice. The line of dialogue where Brooke says the student council wouldn't ever listen to her again seems a bit out of place. Early on in this flashback, Magnipulls tells readers how Tracy will go after anyone, regardless of social standing. The natural
Mm-hmm.
conclusion, even if it's not explicitly stated, is that at least some people on the student council would have been targeted already. So I'm not sure
Yeah.
why they wouldn't listen to Brooke if she got a wedgie.
Yeah. It might be a shortcut, maybe, in some ways, to just sort of sum
Yeah.
up, like, how this is going to be the end of the quote unquote rebellion. Like,
Yeah.
if she gives her a wedgie. Because, I mean, the consequences of this, like I said, if it isn't to make her a martyr and everyone's like, wow, we really need to stop the bullying. Like, in the middle of a speech where she's going to call out Tracy, Tracy bullies her. Like, if everybody doesn't stand up right there and give her a massive, giant school wedgie where everybody in the school gives her a wedgie, which would be really hot, but also probably way too much for one story. You do like 40 stories where she gets a million wedgies. I mean, that's even crazier. Never mind. You have, yeah, like you would probably have Brooke more encouraged to maybe go after her. Same as the whole school, like you said, the council, who would be like, especially if it's like an anime or something where they're like really intense and like super focused and care about the job. They're gonna see that and be like, we gotta stop her. Like, we have this clear evidence of what she's doing. The police were probably not super far off from that, right? Since they just
Yeah.
made a speech and the principal is probably right there to witness this. Like, we have to stop her. So you would think there'd be a lot of consequences to what she did there.
Yeah.
So certainly, like, I guess so. In that, when you look at all that, you can probably say like it's probably maybe a shortcut to be like it's another notch in the
Mm-hmm.
belt of her humiliation. Like, not only she's gonna lose all her friends and everybody's gonna think she's a joke and like all that stuff to sort of show like the lengths the teacher will go to, because we obviously get her very like intense dialogue and stuff, and like how she's gonna enjoy this and how everyone doesn't even like Brooke. So maybe she's right and people are gonna be okay, but you gotta think if like she's willing to do that on stage, nobody's safe, so they're probably not gonna want her in power, and care about that more than like Brooke getting a wedgie. You think?
Yeah. It's just I'm not quite sure how it works out.
Yeah.
Uh, Tracy and Michelle are sort of a mirror for each other, and
Mm,
I think that dynamic is really well done. It's pretty obvious with the flashbacks that they have, um, and they're kind of like their student and teacher. But
yeah.
I think it goes a little deeper than that. It's rival bullies. Really, I think it is the past versus the present.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, like how the past can affect and influence the present.
Yeah. Absolutely. I wonder like where Michelle's gonna go from here. Like, She meets her match with this teacher. Whether we take into account everything that comes later for her or not, is this like a foreshadowing of her future? Like, is she gonna
Mm-hmm.
be a teacher in the future? Not just of wedgies, but I mean, like, literally. Like, is she going to evolve and, like, take what she's learned and try to find her own redemption in educating the next generation to be better, which is a teacher's purpose? So, is that what we're to see with her? I agree they're a mirror, certainly, and I
Mm-hmm.
agree there's definitely more that maybe could be played on with this idea that, like, there's the past and the present and the future
Mm-hmm.
that I guess you could do in the sequels or a longer story where it's like what, like, because their bullying isn't super different, they're sort of very much the same person, and the time difference of 10 years doesn't really matter,
Mm-hmm.
in that, like, they're sort of just same wedgies different day, so to speak. um but yeah, I think it's a really cool point you bring up. That it
Mm-hmm.
definitely, they do feel like a mirror, and for sure that's deliberate because they're supposed to be bonding, and sort of gaining, I guess, this mutual respect for each other, I suppose,
Yeah, a
from the end
grudging
of this.
respect.
Yeah, I like that grudging respect. Yes, that's
Yeah.
good.
There's, I don't know if you picked up on this. There's actually a continuity error uh,
Interesting.
where Michelle pulls Tracy's skirt down, but when she lets
Yeah.
go of the underwear, the skirt is somehow back up, and the stretched underwear is sticking
Oh,
out of it. Then it's back on the
wow.
ground when Tracy retaliates. So
Wow. If
yeah,
only
it's
we had like an animated version of this so we could see that, or like a movie
yeah,
someone adapted it and you get to see the fun continuity errors. Yeah. Certainly
yeah.
not the first person for something like that to get moved around and changed, especially if you're like me and you're adding in more to the wedgies at the end of the story where you're like, I feel like I need to beef this up. And you don't realize, like, as you're describing something, that you tweaked it earlier or changed it.
Hmm.
It's funny to point out some stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. Skirt travels quite a bit.
Mm.
Yeah, I know. I think of like in Lucy and Daniela how in the locker room when Amanda's having Lucy give Daniela a wedgie, her underwear goes from red to white. But
Mm.
I have my own explanation for that, so I don't consider that continuity error.
That's the dream. If they can explain it away in their
Oh,
minds,
I
or if
can.
there's some fan theory that explains it, I'm all happy.
Yeah,
That's funny. Yeah, it's good you flagged it though.
yeah. Uh, the ending was the perfect setup for a continuation, and I'm severely disappointed it wasn't continued so we could see the rest of the
Yeah,
detention.
I love to see that. Yeah,
How would
because
you?
she gives her what, she gives her like 6 weeks or something crazy, right? By the end of the story,
Not
she's
even
like
the rest
supposed
of
to
the
keep coming
detention.
back.
Well, not even just the
Yeah,
rest, not the rest of the detention, just
yeah,
even
yeah,
just
yeah.
this one session. I want to see the end
Yes,
of it
yeah,
because it says at the
totally.
end there's like 30 minutes left or something. So show us the next 30 minutes or
Yeah,
however much time's
yeah. What
left.
happens?
Yeah.
Yeah, what happens there? Yeah, certainly.
What do you?
Yeah,
How do you think
because
the
you
rest of
gotta,
it went?
the rest of it. Yeah, the
Yeah.
rest of that session is a good question. I mean, he leaves it in this open, sort of ambiguous note of
Yeah.
like she's probably gonna come after the teacher again. I mean, Michelle is very hot-headed, as we see in this
Mhm.
story, so I want to think she just like go after the teacher again, and it would be like an NYPD Blue moment where they have another stalemate, or the teacher sort of
Mhm.
puts her down with a wedgie again. And she's like, "We did it again. Like, are you happy now?" And Michelle just keeps coming at her
Yeah.
until they're both kind of tired out and exhausted, and there's like a couple minutes left, and maybe by the end of it we do see that grudging respect, and
Yeah.
like she really is like, okay, I'll be back next week, and it becomes like this like roadrunner coyote thing
Yeah.
where they're like, where they both know like we're neither of us is gonna win this, but like Michelle maybe has like a more positive role model, and like there's all that stuff you could go into there, which the story doesn't
Yeah.
touch, probably because like I said, we're not gonna get that stuff about Michelle and her own home life and stuff, which would be cool, but is maybe more of a Hans Gutherson story or a Magnipulls 2022,
Yeah.
2021 story, and then this 2018 commission is. which is probably more about meeting the demands of like a teacher and student fighting than it is about Michelle finding like a mother figure and like growing.
Yeah. I mean, they are sizing each other up at the end, so they'll definitely have another confrontation at least, if not more. Um, what was the thing? Here, there it is. Okay. As you've detailed before, you really enjoy side characters. Are there any
Yeah.
that stick out here to you?
Yeah, I like Brooke, because she has significance like within the flashback. I think she's great, and I do love her dialogue and how she is so determined to fight against the bullying. I think that's wonderful. And I even like Harriet, who's mentioned, the bully friend and stuff. Probably Brooke's my favorite though. Like of all the characters like in this, like Michelle's my favorite Magnipulls character. Period. Anything she's in, I'll read it and read it happily. But I really like what they did with Brooke, and it would have been cool if we got to see more of Brooke in general, and like does she start like continue her war against bullying? Maybe we see her in some more like current day stories with him doing something, you know.
Yeah. Hmm.
But we don't see her again.
Yeah.
The only Brooke we see mentioned is the Brooke from Lexi and Brooke. Those
Hmm.
two very popular like characters. They appear in some of his stories later on. Just too bad.
Yeah. I remember the thing that I was gonna say. If the if it continued for the however many detentions are after this, it sounds like it would sort of uh, become a blend of Sore Winner by Auntie Cherry and I Could
Mm,
Change Her by Saseda.
yeah,
A
I
competition
think
in
that's great.
detention.
Yeah, competition plus those similar dynamics. I
Uh huh.
think if I could change her as like a psychiatrist, right?
Right.
Versus what I imagine is kind of devilish patient.
Yeah.
Um, and then obviously sore winner we get a parent and a daughter, and so very interesting dynamics that sort of bring a lot with them.
Hmm.
Someone's obviously in a position of power,
Yep.
exerting that or losing it, which is interesting from a
Hmm.
submission domination perspective. It adds a lot to
Yeah.
the or charges the scenes with some energy. Um, certainly if we kept seeing these play out, we would get, it feels like, that competition. Is Tracy going as far as like, I'm gonna show you the wedgies I gave 10 years ago, techniques I used, here's stuff we did. Like, is she helping her become a better bully? Like,
Yeah, that'd be interesting if like Michelle brought her back to
yeah,
her
like
bullying
does
ways.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, like instead it's like a reverse Lucy and Daniela where like instead of helping the bully change, the
Yeah.
bully helps the teacher become a bully again, like
Yeah.
something bonkers like that. Like, is that what happened? Like, I don't know. It's interesting that it feels like it's at a point where there's a lot of branching paths, which I guess is inevitable when it's the first piece, left kind of ambiguously open. And we
Hmm.
know Magnipulls obviously has a sort of rare ambition, or did have a rare ambition in the community for branching stories and very large arcs that encompassed a lot of characters and adventures.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the door is wide open for all kinds of possibilities. If
Yes.
only he had given us some of those.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
what we have is great. Um,
Yeah.
and so, when discussing realism in stories, I have a question I like to pose. Out of the four Earths I'm about to describe, what do you believe teacher student bonding falls under? Realistic Earth, where Earth is normal as we live it every day. Alternate Earth, where Earth is changed to some degree, mainly focusing on wedgies. Idealistic Earth, where Earth is changed to fit the desires of the wedgie community or some aspect of it, depending on the writer. or fantastical Earth, where Earth is changed to be unrecognizable, like Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons. And it can also be a mix of those
Mm.
four. It can change between them, be none at all. It can be something entirely different.
Interesting. Yeah, I think, and I feel like there's a pattern with a lot of the ones we've been talking about. But correct me if I'm wrong. It feels idealistic.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Um, yeah, I feel like that's what we've said for a couple of them. But I like idealistic, as you
Yeah.
know. I'm always gonna like stories like that because they are exciting and
Mm-hmm.
arousing, which is the core and I guess one of the defining characteristics of this genre compared to like any other, and I guess puts it within the broader literotica sort of genre of writing. Ours just has to do with wedgies and their
Mm-hmm.
relationship with people, obviously. But yeah, I think idealistic for this for obvious reasons, including how idealistic the wedgies are, where they are very over the top, super stretchy underwear. The obvious simplicity of a teacher and student going to the lengths they do, and the wedgies they give each other. I mean, there's a story where it's much more toned down and it's very tiny pulls and something like that I could see as realistic where something could happen in a moment, but clearly this is built up. They both have very long and storied histories as bullies, which is kind of idealistic in itself as a
Mm-hmm.
setup, where it's kind of like I mentioned, Godzilla versus Kong, unstoppable force meets immovable object with wedgies. So I think that sort of puts it in idealistic.
Yeah. That absolutely, yeah. And I think the reason why people love idealistic Earth stories is because it is a story that's showing us what what we want to see,
Mm,
like what we'd like
yeah,
to happen, but no, probably won't happen,
sure.
and it lets us go further than what we'd normally be able to do.
Yeah, and it still has that like enough realism in it
Uh
that
huh.
we know what we're getting into, and probably is what a lot of people are looking for. I don't know. We don't really have the info to say do people want the super epic fantasy stories where wedgies are obviously a key part of the world, but there's also stuff like magic involved and different races and all this stuff? Or do people simply want the easy to get into? And may be of the same quality. They don't have to be worse just because they're not fantasy
Mm-hmm.
or involve different races, sort of thing. But the shorter, generally shorter, stories of a teacher and a student who are both bullies and have given wedgies, battling it out. And is that what they want? Realistic, like high school, college, sort of setting that we could picture in every day that we can imagine in our head pretty easily. Like, is that what most readers are gonna want? Because that's easy for them to get into, so to speak. So yeah, it feels idealistic because it is closer to real life, maybe in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a much lower um, barrier of entry.
I like that. It's a good way
Yeah.
to sum it up.
Yeah. So with Magni Pulls gone from DA, what do you
Yeah,
think his legacy and impact has been and will continue to be?
that's a great question. I think he was a big inspiration for a lot of creatives. I think the most obvious thing and the thing I want to touch on is what we've touched on a bit already, but this idea that he had such massive ambition. And it's kind of crazy for me to think that he saw others having similar ambition. And by ambition, I mean this fact that he wrote what you could consider basically like almost 10 years, less than that, but around there, kind of like I don't know, what was it, 8 or something years epic of a story that went over multiple different series, Camp No Name, Haley the Bully, Wedgie Witch War, like multiple series, multiple characters, all the Fuchsia Freak stuff, culminating in this like series where a lot of arcs are completed and characters are changed and moving on to different things and stuff like that. And like the fact he does that, I think, is very significant because it's never really been done to that extent over that many years, over that many stories and characters to have such a big culmination of events. And like the fact he even, I think, significantly too, was brand building in that he was having art in all these pieces as well. So like showing, and even like in Haley the Bully, which I think is an amazing love letter to the fetish community, we see a lot of that just on the smaller scale of like he was pulling in a lot of famous wedgie fetish story characters, including Daniela from Lucy and Daniela. She appears in that, but there's a lot of others like Ashley and Luna appeared in that, and Lexi and Brooke have appeared in other stories by him, and I think in those ones too. So like this great one of the probably the best love letters to the fetish community and the fetish in general, I think. But yeah, that ambition I think is so key. And when I mentioned at the beginning, like that he could see others as having ambition too or being inspired by it, I think is wild. I just want to quickly read the note he sent me, like when he left DA, and I didn't catch this right away, but he was gone for like a day or something, and I saw he was gone, and it broke my heart. And he sent me a note. It was very short. I'll just read it if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Where he said, I just wanted to say that your support has encouraged myself and so many other writers to continue pushing on. Thank you so much for that. I know I'll never be able to repay the kindness you've shown. As a huge fan of you, your storytelling, and your ambition, I know that you'll find great success with whatever you plan to do next. And he put
Wow.
his cute little like upside down VWV like little emoji, the smiley
Hmm.
face thing. It almost
Oh,
brings me to tears reading it to
yeah.
you now. Like think about that.
Yeah.
Like I said, we were friends for some years, as is often the case with me and others in the community. Like I'll get in touch with them. I did the Q&A with him, and I'll sort of like drift out of contact. I won't talk to him for a while, but when I was reading through like Camp Noname, sharing my thoughts, like commenting on them, it meant a lot to him. I could tell, and he really enjoyed like writer to writer like conversations like that. But
Hmm.
for him to say like I have ambition and stuff, I was like it was wild to see somebody who at the end of like the Wedgie Witch's War, which is like we said, it's something like 8 years or something as a rough estimate, like 8 years story, like an effort to spend all this stuff. He's writing consistently, he's getting art, like that's crazy. It's a testament to like what we creatives can do,
Hmm.
and we can look up at Magnipulls and be like, thank you for showing us like we can do so much. We can create our own Marvel Cinematic Universe. And
Hmm.
clearly, as a fan of superheroes, I'm a fan of that universe who took from it directly in some cases. Like, he was doing it before any of us were doing it. And he's showing like you can do it on an epic scale, and you can have arcs, and it can be cartoony and creative and funny and memeish. Um, but it can also be like really heartwarming and touching and stuff. And I think that's a big part of his legacy, that ambition without being like a jerk. Like he's such a nice guy. And like you see the Q&A I did with him, he's just down to
Hmm.
earth and chill, and was just really open and a good person. So I know I miss him a lot, and I hope he comes back big time and keeps writing and like keeps surpassing all of us and everything he's doing. He was the best.
Well, if he doesn't, then that was a wonderful send off.
It's true.
I don't think I can add to it. It was too well done. So before we close out, I have sort of a meta question for you.
Okay.
When do you think a wedgie story is a wedgie story, and when is it a story with a wedgie in it?
Wow. That's a great question. So I think the answer to this that I typically give when I think about it is like the wedgie has to be incredibly central to it. I think I've told you this cliche before, but and I think you maybe disagree with me, but I might be wrong on this. Where like if you can take the wedgie out of the story and it still makes sense, then you failed and it's not a wedgie story. And I'm
Mm.
obviously pulling from Isaac Asimov, I think it was, who said in science fiction, if you can take the science out of it, and it should be obviously detailed and like mechanical science, like deep science. If you pull all that stuff out and it still makes sense as a story, is like coherent, then you failed. So I've adapted that, and I think that's a good place to start when we're thinking about it. So to give an example, I want the story I mentioned to you, and I posted like the prologue of Many Memories of Wedgies, the epic fantasy one that I need to continue. I want Wedgies to be an incredibly central part of that, to be part of a religion that a character builds, to be part of a magic system that a character, the protagonist, has, and to be like a pretty central part of like the politics of the an evil queen character. Bit of a cliche, the evil queen, but she's gonna be so cool if I could pull it off. She'd be so great. Um, I guess a more obvious example is something like a dulling a knife because that's finished, or like
Yeah.
a that's a good example because wedgies there are pretty central
Yeah.
to the world. They happen a lot. There's indirect detail, so to speak, in things like Claire having gone around giving them and having this reputation as someone who is a very feared wedgie giver who would hang up her enemies and stuff. And that's just sort of accepted. That's sort of fine. And if we strip out all that stuff, like there literally is not really a story. Like if you take out every single wedgie, it's not really coherent. It's like what why is June doing what she's doing? Why or like how is she getting close to Caroline and like all this stuff? It doesn't make any sense if you take out
Mhm.
wedgies. If we did that story differently and we have it like she gets beat up, and there's also like a little wedgie or something, and the wedgie's not the main reason for her revenge, and the wedgie's not the thing that she constantly is going back to, so much so that a character is like, why are you so obsessed with wedgies? In a line I didn't like at first, but I've come to appreciate because others really liked it, as I've noted when we did that podcast episode.
Mhm.
So, and then throughout, like, obviously every relationship in that comes back to wedgies in some way. Every like connection that characters have, it revolves around wedgies. So I feel like that's like a great example of it. And then other stories we'll read, you'll be like, why? Like this could be a normal story and it could be cool. Like there's a little wedgie that happens during some very intense, like I don't know, whatever scene, and you're like, this could be a story that has a wedgie in it, and it feels very different
Mhm.
than the kind of stuff I want to do generally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Hmm. That's interesting because I it seems like I prefer to write stories with wedgies in them then.
Sure. No, and that's totally fair. And I mean,
Yeah.
they're probably going to, those are going to be the stories, right, that you can get published. They don't even need to have wedgies in them. But I mean, the more you're doing stories like that, probably you're going to be building up the chops to get published, to write successfully in any other sort of career, whereas you're focusing on wedgie stories. It's very different. It's its own genre
Yeah.
where the wedgies have to be a core focus. That's always been my approach to it. Others might say, oh, no, you don't need to. But I mean, in a lot of the stuff I've been doing over the years, it's been how can I make it an incredibly core part of it? The shortcut, obviously, being, as I told you, make a character a wedgie fetishist.
Yeah.
Therefore they're always thinking about it. It's
Right.
got excuses to come up, and that's
Mhm.
obviously a trick we learned from early on stories like Sadistic and Blood Money and stuff like that. There's no reason for characters not to be thinking about them or for them to be coming up frequently when they're a fetishist. But certainly, yeah, like a lot of writers you'll see and who've come and gone, they're here just because they like to write. Most of them have ambitions of becoming professional writers who are just doing this because they like wedgies and they want to practice it, but they're very quickly going to move on to professional writing or other stuff, to
Mhm.
maybe stories with wedgies in them, to then just stories that don't have wedgies. It's kind of like a stepping stone for a lot of writers,
Hmm.
understandably. Um, and I'm okay with that. I've never held it against anybody who's like, "Hey, I've done this a couple times. I wrote some stories. I'm off to like better and brighter things." I think that was Anime Panty's goal originally when he came in. He was writing just to get better at it, and because he had like dreams of getting published and being a big writer and stuff. Um, and he obviously, because of me and others who liking his work, he was really interested in doing more of it and more,
Yeah.
and it's obviously spiraled. And that can sometimes happen too if you find a community and you find people
Hmm.
who like your work. I guess often when that doesn't happen, which as you know is often the case, you're gonna be like, "Hey, this is another reason for me to move on to like the actual serious writing." And I hear that a lot. People call it serious writing. Um, that they want to do.
Hmm. Interesting. That's fascinating. I'm just very curious to hear your take on it. 'Cause I guess I don't have a very firm definition of which, but I like something that I picked up on how on what I've been writing. So
Yeah,
minus the odd one here and there, but
sure.
that's kind of just like, yeah, I'm curious what Hans thinks about this.
I love that you asked that. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this. I've felt like, for I guess, other than the rare occasion where for some reason I'd want it to be like the wedgies aren't very central. Maybe the more realistic you want it to be, you want it to just be a little wedgie that kind of happens just randomly. But generally I've always felt like, yeah, to be a wedgie story, they need to be a central part of the narrative. And not everybody's
Okay.
into that, certainly. Like we've seen, I don't have some of the numbers as we know as some other writers who are writing like really, or even just like some of those stories that are really big hits, like a Break Free is an example of a story with wedgies in it.
Hmm.
I think maybe no, that might not be a good example because they're pretty central to that in some ways. But I feel like later on chapters of it, you don't even get any wedgies like at all. I think,
Hmm.
and that often happens too in stories. A trend we see with writers who want to do quote unquote serious writing. They'll write some wedgies and they'll be like, okay, now here's the real story I want to tell. Just nothing to do with wedgies. And you're like, well, where's the wedgies? I want to read it. And it's like, too bad. Now you're getting like the deep teenage angst or whatever story that
Yeah.
has nothing to do with wedgies. And you're like, oh, so I'm sure you've probably seen that. It's not unheard of, certainly.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss?
I think that was great. We covered a lot as
Yeah.
always. I'm gonna miss Magnipulls. Is a good friend of mine. I responded to that note he sent right away, just like I don't know why you're sending me this because I had no idea he left then.
Hmm.
But thank you so much. Pretty much, I said like you're a great friend of mine. I'm glad to know you. Like you're the best. And then I see he's gone. I was just like, my heart's broken now. Like
Yeah.
you're the best. Like so I'm gonna miss him. I'm glad we can keep him alive. Although like you've seen his numbers on DA, it's
Oh
like more
yeah.
than 2,000 watchers. Like no one's left from watching him since he said he's gone. Either just because they're excited for him to come back, or like that's just something you don't do. You just stick around because you love them. You're showing that support even after they're gone.
Yeah.
Um, and we always hold out hope. I think we're hopeful people, wedgie
Absolutely.
fetishists in general. I think we have to be when we want to see something as rare as wedgies. We generally
Yeah.
have to be like, yeah, we're gonna see them one day. They'll be there.
Yeah.
One day, someone will pull someone's underwear,
It's a
and
it's a
one day Magni pulls will come back.
it's it it's helpful, and it's a good sign that the he didn't delete his profile.
Yeah, that's
So
great. Yeah,
the chance of coming back is a little
yeah,
higher.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I certainly think so. And we got all those stories to enjoy. If we didn't, it would have been interesting if we saw like a Between Two Cheeks happen where someone had all their stories saved. Although they had fewer stories and art than Magnipulls has, it would still be interesting to see like if he's like, oh, it's deleted, and then like all of a sudden someone pops up like, here's all the Magnipulls stuff.
Mhm.
That would have been kind of crazy. But yeah, no, I'm glad because you're right. It does open up like he could come back they'll return with some other 8 year story with 14 arcs and 27 subplots and 100 characters, and we'll be there for every single part of it.
Yeah. And even if he doesn't, it's nice that he didn't get rid of this because people really enjoy what he
Yeah,
wrote. So that's really nice.
totally,
Um,
totally.
all right. Do you have anything you want to promote?
Magnipulls. Go read all of his stories, starting with teacher-student bonding. And then go through all of Camp No Name, first to end of that, and you'll get what I'm talking about. If you haven't read all that, if you just glance to some of it, you'll see some of the context. It's a lot to read, but it'll keep you busy. And there's some really great widgets in there. And then tell me who your favorite character was in that whole universe. That's what I want to know to your audience.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to leave that in the comments if you know
Yeah, leave
if
it
you
in
have
the
a favorite
comments.
character.
Love it.
All right. Wow. And so ends another supreme discussion with Hans Gutherson. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. I love it.
Absolutely. If there are any topics, stories, ideas, etc., that you'd like to hear me discuss, or if you'd like to come on for an episode, leave a comment or send me a message on DeviantArt or Lucky Fetish as New Fatora. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Best Book Club.